The morning of the 4th of July, and the residents of Crater woke to find the British back in force. Mitchell's press officer now arrived with the British and world press in tow. The gentlemen of the press were greeted by 6 pipers, playing Scotland the Brave.
Right, y'all, welcome to the Come Arms channel. Okay, so today we're checking out something that is very low-key, at least probably for most of the American audience, kind of growing up with American history, everything kind of focused around just the U.S. This is definitely not something that I would have been exposed to without the channel, and definitely without actually talking with and working with people just from other countries. Specifically, this one is going to be from the UK. So I was doing a sort of a planning conference, and there was a gentleman who I was talking with, and he actually recommended this one. So this specifically, he was talking about Mad Mitch's tribal law. And if you kind of look into that, it immediately it's kind of talking and centered around the Aden emergency, and specifically like around the Battle of Crater 2. So it's definitely a low-key topic, and trying to find videos about it. They're definitely very few and far between. There is it looks pretty in-depth one. It's about an hour long, but of course, for something like that, when it comes to a reaction video, it's definitely a big ask for y'all to kind of sit around for that long. But this one's about 24 minutes long, and it looks like it goes over the Aden emergency and the Battle of Crater, and also kind of goes a little bit more in depth into kind of the Mad Mitch tribal law aspect of it as well. But it sounded like a very interesting topic. It also sounded very similar to a lot of other things that we've checked out. So maybe we can kind of draw some similarities, or also see if there's any sort of crossover with any of those specific events or even like specific units. But should be an interesting one. Let's go ahead and check it out.
The Aden Emergency, 1963 to 67, is another one of those forgotten conflicts that marked the end of the British Empire. Over 90 British servicemen were killed and 500 wounded in a 4-year war that not only has been largely forgotten, but which Britain never really wanted to fight in the first place.
Yeah, 4 years.
It also brought to the fore a
not a small conflict.
British Army officer, Lieutenant Colonel Colin Mitchell, dubbed by the press Mad Mitch. I want to tell this story because my dad actually served in Aden, although just a little bit before the emergency, and was constantly humming the pipe tune, The Barren Rocks of Aden. It's time to find out a little bit more about the Aden Emergency in the 1960s.
We'll listen to that after this.
The British had seized the port of Aden in what is now the country of Yemen in 1839. Interestingly, it was the very first addition to Queen Victoria's empire. When Captain Haynes landed his party of Royal Marines at the rocky port, little did he realise that it would be the Royal Marines who would be the last British troops to leave 120 years later.
I think 4 or 5 commandos.
The port became an important coaling station for ships travelling to Britain's empire in India and beyond. And from the 1860s, it gained further importance as a gateway to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal at the end of it.
Yeah, it's about that time,
Aden was surrounded by a bare wasteland of deserts and hills, inhabited by various tribes under hereditary rulers.
Look at that.
Over time, the British signed agreements with these leaders and established protectorates, whose sole purpose was to act as a buffer zone between their port in Aden and the Ottoman Turks in Yemen.
Wow, the Ottoman Turks. Yeah, I mean, I really forget like how massive the British Empire was. I mean, you can kind of see it. There's British influence all over the globe still, but it's pretty impressive when you actually like go and see it and see just like where all these pockets are. But it is kind of cool because I mean, if you kind of look at it, it looks a little bit like random in some spots, but it's kind of interesting to hear like how they landed, but also like what the intent is and kind of like what they set up in that area once they got there.
The port itself was actually ruled as part of the British Raj in India until 1937, when London took over direct control and Aden became a crown colony. By the 1950s, the Deepwater Harbour was the second busiest in the world after New York, with 5,000 vessels a year dropping anchor there. It also became a duty-free mecca for passenger liners. As the British Empire was being rolled back in places like India, strategic thinking centred on Britain's dependence on the oil reserves of the Middle East. Aden was seen as an ideal base from which the British could exercise military as well as political influence.
I wonder when the oil industry
consequently a large RAF base was established, and in the early 1960s, thousands of British servicemen and their families were stationed in this sunny, peaceful and barren patch of Arabia. In many ways, these servicemen and their families were enjoying a lifestyle that many Brits now seek in places like Dubai and Oman. But even in this sleepy backwater of the British Empire, change was afoot. In 1956, Egyptian nationalist leader Gamal Nasser had succeeded in nationalising the Suez Canal and then humiliating both Britain and France during the Suez Crisis. I've made a video about the Suez Crisis and will post a link in the description below. Actually, I'll also add it as a link at the very end of this story. Overnight, Nasser became a hero in the Arab world, even down in sleepy Aden. Taking their lead from Nasser's Cairo radio, trade unions in Aden launched a series of strikes and riots.
It is interesting to see like the trickle-down effect for something
across the border in Yemen,
close, but not necessarily in the same area.
The National Liberation Front, or NLF, was formed and supported by Nasser. The British decided to counter the rising nationalist sentiments by creating a friendly regime around their military base.
Yeah, from my understanding, there was a bunch of like kind of, I guess like Arab specific groups in the area that ended up kind of fighting or, causing this resistance. And I think some were kind of sponsored by, one was sponsored by Egypt, from what I read before. But basically like a bunch of these kind of factions making up this resistance, but also like infighting against each other as well.
In 1963, the various tribal leaders in the protectorates were persuaded to join the Crown Colony of Aden to form the Federation of South Arabia. With its own army and police, the Federation was promised independence from Britain in 1968 in return for a long-term lease on their military base, something akin to the agreements in Cyprus.
Interesting.
At the end of the year, the NLF launched a grenade attack on the British High Commissioner, and whilst he escaped injury, 51 others weren't so lucky, one of them being killed, the rest injured.
Damn.
The following month,
must have been
the
a lot of
Federal
grenades.
Government's army, the South Arabian Army, SAA, moved into the Radfan region about 60 miles north of Aden itself to counter the growing NLF influence. Having reasserted control, the SAA then withdrew, only for the NLF to immediately sweep in again on their departure.
All the acronyms.
Between April and May 1964, the SAA went in again, this time with the support of the regular British Army. Over the next few months, units from the Royal Scots, Coldstream Guards...
Dude, I mean, look at the freaking terrain that these guys are operating in. Yeah, so the Royal Scots... Oh, the Coldstream Guards even as well. That's crazy. And the Paras, the Royal... I'm not familiar with the Royal Anglians. Okay, so yeah, the Royal Scots. Yeah, and I think that's where kind of the person I was talking with drew that kind of connection specifically was the Scots.
The Royal
I think they had a big
Anglians,
part in the Battle of
Regiment,
Crater.
45 Commando were involved in several ferocious firefights with the NLF, losing 4 of their number. Eventually, the Radfan area was subdued, but the NLF merely switched their insurgency towards the urban port of Aden instead, and a state of emergency, the Aden Emergency, was declared. Down in Aden, the NLF came up not just against the SAA and the British, but against a rival nationalist movement too. The Front for the Liberation of Occupied South Yemen, FLOSSY, drew its strength from the trade unions in the port area. And whilst they and the NLF had a common agenda, getting rid of the British and the tribal sultans, their rivalry with each other would be fought out in the streets of Aden over the coming years, and cost a lot more lives than they lost to the British.
Damn.
In 1966, whilst this insurgency gathered pace, the British government conducted a review of military spending and priorities. Secretary of Defence Dennis Healey concluded that the British were in no position to exert any significant military power in the Middle East, and that
it would be interesting to kind of hear from potentially some of y'all, or if you heard anything from any of your relatives about this kind of showing up on TV and kind of what the general consensus was for, I mean, maybe just like the Brits as a whole, but also just in like your local area, or specifically if you're in the military, kind of what the sentiment was in regards to this. And you do see, like, especially with like the Iranian embassy siege, for example, there's a lot of kind of coverage for things like that. So there's definitely some major events happening that people are kind of following on TV. So it'd be interesting to kind of hear if this kind of made maybe not the same amount of headlines, but made like pretty big headlines enough so there's like a kind of sentiment that everybody could derive from.
Therefore, a military base in Aden was surplus to requirement. He boldly announced that when the Federation of South Arabia gained independence in 2 years' time, the British military forces would leave, saving the British taxpayer an estimated £20 million. So, from out of the blue, the British gave 2 years' notice that they were quitting Aden in its entirety. The federal government were aghast. They had all entered into the Federation, not least because the British military were going to be there to protect them against both the NLF and their neighbours post-independence. Meanwhile, the NLF and Flossie were delighted. The British were going, and there was going to be no post-imperial base in their country. All they needed to do was make sure the British didn't have a change of mind, and also undermine the federal government at the same time.
That's going to affect both sides very
as well as taking
dramatically.
each other out. They stepped up their campaigns of violence.
As far as
In
like the
December
motivation
1966, an Aden Airways
to fight
DC-3 on
back.
an internal flight was blown up, killing all 30 people on board.
Dude.
In January 1967, riots by both sets of supporters broke out in the old Arab quarter of Aden. Built in the centre of an extinct volcano,
Oh, yeah, I was about to say
the
it's
area
Crater,
was
huh?
simply known as Crater.
Oh, no
The local
kidding.
police rapidly lost control of the situation, and the British High Commissioner ordered the British Army to be deployed. In the
Damn,
next
that
6 months,
went-
the British troops
it went
patrolling
down really
Crater
quick.
faced 60 grenade or shooting attacks and returned fire on 40 occasions. They'd also be accused of heavy-handed tactics on the streets and torture of prisoners. And meanwhile, they in turn were taking more and more casualties in a conflict which their government had already acknowledged had no end goal, bar leaving the colony in the hands of a friendly government.
Golly, yeah, that's a tough position to be in for the troops. I mean, like, you're in this situation, there's a lot of violence happening around you. Your government has kind of already said, like, look, there's no, like, end state, there's no, like, long-term goal, there's no longevity. But then you also are kind of, like, working this operation to try and keep the peace. But, I mean, when you're kind of being under constant attack and whatnot and kind of harassment, yeah, it's going to be a really tough position. So it'd be interesting to hear some interviews from maybe like some of the leadership or the officers at the time, as far as like what it was like with kind of like how they communicated with their troops or how they kind of directed them, whether it be, you know, to kind of chill out or, you know, other tactics.
On the 20th of June, 1967, the SAA in Crater mutinied and were rapidly followed by the local armed police. The police
no
broke into their own
kidding,
armory
dude.
and armed NLF supporters. 5 insurgents positioned a machine gun in the minaret of a mosque and opened fire on a police car, killing both occupants. A British civil servant, Hugh Alexander, in a passing car was also killed in the crossfire. Now by chance,
Damn, dude.
a Bedford truck carrying 19 soldiers from the Royal Corps of Transport happened to come down the road at that minute and was shot up. 8 men inside were killed.
Damn.
Whilst an Arab NCO used the minaret's microphone to call on the remaining men to surrender, armoured cars from one parachute regiment suddenly arrived on the scene and got the survivors to safety.
Fuck yeah. Good
Meanwhile,
stuff.
4 members of the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers had entered Crater from Marine Drive in a Saracen armoured car. The vehicle was hit, and the officer, 20-year-old Second Lieutenant John Davies, ordered the men to bail out and run for cover. All 4 men were killed. Their bodies were mutilated and pulled through the streets and
That's
burned.
fucked.
In another attack, 3 members of the Argyle
Damn.
and Sutherland
That's
Highlanders
gotta
who'd
be
only just
such a
arrived
tough
in
call for
Aden
that
were also
lieutenant.
killed. And so the long day went on. A helicopter flying over Crater was shot down. Fusilier John Duffy was mentioned in dispatches for going back into the burning hulk to carry out both the pilot and his lance corporal.
No kidding. What
In
a
total that day,
badass, dude.
23 British soldiers, together with that civilian, were killed. Crater suddenly became a no-go zone for the British.
I wonder if he got a
And
Victoria
in one
Cross for
respect,
that.
why should the British care? The government in London had already determined that they would speed up their withdrawal and pull out by the end of the year. Why waste British lives? But one man was determined not to let the insurgents dictate
there
the
he
agenda,
is.
nor to allow the British Lion to spend its last days in Aden cowering outside Crater. Enter Lieutenant Colonel Colin Campbell Mitchell, commander of the newly arrived 1st Battalion of the Argyle and Sutherland Highlanders. Despite their recent arrival, they had already
Right, that's
lost
part of
3
the-
men
that's
in
like the
that
Royal
attack on the
Scots now,
20th of
right?
June, and Mitchell was itching to have a go at the Arab fighters in Crater,
of 'em.
who are now estimated to number about 400. His subsequent actions would become almost legendary. The Argyle and Sutherlands were a product of the 1881 Childers reforms, which brought together the 91st Regiment, Argyle Highlanders, and the 93rd Regiment of Foot, the Sutherland Highlanders. Both regiments had been formed at the end of the 18th century during the wars with revolutionary France, and had served in some of the great battles fought by the British
Damn,
Army.
that's old
New
school.
Orleans in the British-American War of 1812, Lucknow in the Indian Revolt of 1857, Ginginlodvu in the Zulu War, and most
Yeah, they
famously as part of that Thin Red Line at the Battle of Balaclava during the Crimea.
Isn't that
Mitchell
what they're also
himself
called,
was
the
the son of Scottish
Balaclava
parents,
Regiment
but
or
had been brought
something?
up in Croydon, South London, where, at the age of 15, he joined the Home Guard in 1940. By
Dude, so they have some
1943,
history.
he'd enlisted in the
Holy
Royal West
cow.
Kents as a private, before being commissioned in the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders in 1944. He managed to see the tail end of the Italian campaign in World War II before
No
gaining
kidding.
a wealth of counter-insurgency experience after the war in Palestine, Cyprus, Kenya and Borneo.
Dude, so he has
He
been
was
there and
determined to
done
use that experience to, well, if not reverse the British withdrawal from Aden, to at least do it with British heads held high. To that end, he actively lobbied to have his regiment sent to Aden. In fact, he was so keen to make an impact in Aden that he modelled their base back in the UK on the key streets in Crater. And his lobbying paid off. They were posted to the southern tip of Arabia in the summer of 1967.
So he was kind of
So
he was lobbying to
that
get
their
them out there.
advance guard were there in the battle on the 20th of June. In the following 2 weeks, the rest of the battalion arrived, and as they did so, Mitchell organised nighttime reconnaissance missions to observe enemy dispositions.
Oh, dude, right
in
away.
Crater. This included Mitchell personally driving his Land Rover into the no-go area.
Honestly, this seems a lot. It's kind of a, maybe it's a weird comparison, I don't know, but from my time when I was in Israel, this draws a lot of similarities almost with like the Gaza Strip, because I mean you had like the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, doing also like these kind of like nighttime reconnaissance missions. So I mean, 1967. This is also around the same time as the 6-Day War.
From these observations, he laid out
well.
a plan to reoccupy the rebel stronghold on the night
Which
of the
probably
3rd
has an
of
effect
July.
on this too.
He codenamed the operation Stirling Castle in honour of their regimental HQ back in Scotland. As the red sun dropped over the
Damn, look
western
at that
horizon
thing.
on the 3rd of July 1967, darkness descended on Aden. The men of the Argyll and Sutherlands waited in anticipation for the signal to go. Alongside them, the Queen's Dragoon Guards had arrived to provide armoured support if needed. At 7:05 the radio crackled. "We're moving." And then a strange sound came across the dark Arabian night. Bagpipes.
Oh,
Lieutenant
dude.
Colonel Colin Mitchell was entering a rebel stronghold, accompanied by Pipe Major Kenneth Robson playing the regimental charge, Monymusk.
Okay, I need to
He was
listen to
almost
that too.
daring the
Hopefully we can
NLF
find these
and
on
Flossie
YouTube.
to have a fight with him. As it was, they met no opposition. Earlier in the day, a Wessex helicopter
I don't want
had
to
flown
fight
low
against somebody
across the
who's
Arabian
taking
Sea
bagpipes into
and
battle.
landed the men of B Company from the Scottish Regiment on the Ras Marshag Peninsula. They would advance towards Mitchell's column in a pincer movement.
Oh, okay.
And it was B Company who had inflicted the only casualty that night, as an Arab fighter ran out of the cinema to challenge them.
Just one dude.
Reaching the Treasury building in the centre of Crater, Mitchell's second in command, Major Nigel Crowe, stood in the middle of the street and negotiated in Arabic for the occupants to surrender, which
Oh,
they did.
damn.
By 10 p.m,
That's pretty
Mitchell
cool he
had
could
taken
speak
over the
Arabic.
business and banking area and set up his HQ. All that remained in rebel hands was the HQ of the armed police. The morning of the 4th of July, and the residents of Crater woke to find the British back in force.
Imagine that,
Mitchell's
just
press
waking up and be
officer
like,
now
what
arrived
happened
with British
overnight?
and world press in tow. The gentlemen of the press were greeted by 6 pipers playing Scotland the Brave from the roof of Mitchell's temporary
Okay,
headquarters.
let's add that
was
to
a
the
PR
playlist,
coup.
to the queue.
Here was an operation that had cost not a single British casualty, commanded by a dashing officer who seemed to be acting more like a character from the previous century when the British Empire was being built, rather than when it was being disbanded.
Interesting.
Stephen
Yeah,
Harper
it's an
from the
interesting way
Daily
to put
Express
that.
dubbed this new hero Mad Mitch, the man who tamed Crater.
Dude was not fucking around.
Mitchell became an instant celebrity, and in turn, other celebrities wanted to be near Mitchell. Comedian Tony Hancock arrived in Aden and visited Mad Mitch in Crater, followed by Harry Seacombe, who with great fanfare
Weird.
and hilarity performed the opening ceremony of the new toilet for D Company. The press loved
I wonder if there's
Mitchell's
any,
no-nonsense sense
footage
of
of that.
counterinsurgency tactics. Basically, if the NLF or Flossie showed their heads, they'd be shot off. Those were Mitchell's own words.
Damn.
But others,
Yeah, he's really
not
not
least in the
fucking around.
military hierarchy, were alarmed by his cavalier tactics. On one occasion, a senior officer was horrified to see a box of 36 Mills grenades opened and primed, despite Mitchell not seeking
Oh
authorization
my
for their
god.
use. Nor were they happy about the way that he both courted the media and seemed to be lapping up the notoriety, especially when other regiments were also
I mean, hey,
fighting
he
the
sent the
NLF
message
elsewhere
very
in Aden. Soon Mitchell was being brought into line. It started at the Armed Police HQ, when his ultimate commander, the general officer commanding Middle East land forces, General Philip Tower, arrived to lead the negotiations. Unlike Mitchell's bullish approach, Tower offered to work alongside the police to govern Crater going forward.
It'd be interesting to kind of hear
and they
them
would
having
do
a
so
conversation.
with no question of recrimination for the events of the 20th of June.
Interesting.
Mitchell could hardly believe his ears. The men who had mutinied and then killed nearly 24 British troops, including 3 of his own regiment, were to face no consequences for their actions.
Dude, that's a
This
tough,
is where
tough pill
military
to
operations and high politics butt up against each other. It's ever the way. Towers was fully aware that the British government wanted to be out of Aden, not in 1968 as planned, but before the year was out. The political imperative was to get out of Aden with as few losses as humanly possible. He ordered Mitchell to throttle back in the interests of a political
Well,
settlement.
it's going to be interesting to see how this turns out.
Despite the initial success in occupying Crater without any losses, the insurgency resumed in just a couple of weeks. Between then and the end of August, there were 91 attacks on Mitchell's troops.
Damn, dude.
And in these hostile, nerve-jangling conditions, just like in a lot of urban counter-terrorism operations, his men were accused of overstepping the mark on more than one occasion, something he vehemently denied.
I mean, yeah, it's pretty tough to be told to like throttle back while your men are being constantly attacked. It's a very tough position for him to be in. But I mean, again, it just seems like right off the bat, they didn't kind of agree on the approach to this.
Whilst Crater would never again become a no-go zone for the British, it was never really a safe zone either. As the summer drew to a close, the British started to fall back on Aden itself in readiness for the enforced independence of the Federation. In the outlying
weird to have a
districts, the
timeline
SAA
on
took
it.
over
Maybe
military
not, but
affairs, but they'd been
tough for the
hopelessly
troops.
infiltrated by NLF members. And those who weren't supporting the insurgents were looking to the new post-British world and could see where it was heading. Why fight a lost cause for the Federation? Across the former protectorates, Sultan after Sultan was toppled by armed NLF supporters. In Aden itself,
Dude, these
Flossie fought an
pictures are, like,
increasingly bitter street war with
super
their nationalist
interesting.
rivals to become the post-colonial government.
Damn. Oh, yeah, so they're just trying to like, everybody's just trying to get in line to set up the government after the Brits leave. Yeah, look at this. This is insanely urban. So having to fight in warfare like this.
It was a battle in which the British were reduced to the role of spectators. I mean, they could have tried to control the situation, but what was the point? As General Tower later
true.
said, quote, "How can you justify to a mother in, say, Yorkshire, that her son had been killed in inter-Arab fighting in a place that we were leaving a few weeks or even few days later?" Unquote. Slowly, the British fell back towards the RAF base from where they'd be ultimately evacuated. Over the 6 months running up to November 1967,
Evacuated?
30,000 military personnel
Interesting.
were evacuated from Aden. It was a huge undertaking.
Damn.
A naval task force of 24 ships, including 12 warships, headed to Aden. On the 23rd of November
Like some
1967,
Dunkirk shit.
the aircraft carrier HMS Albion dropped anchor off the port. She was joined by 2 further aircraft carriers, HMS Eagle and HMS Bulwark. Britain was ready to do anything to get her troops out. Meanwhile,
It's really
Hercules
interesting to see, like, the
C-130s
old-
were taking off
What is
every
this?
30 minutes from the RAF base,
The old
carrying
ships,
military
the aircraft
personnel
carriers
out
and
to
stuff.
Bahrain and then on to the UK. And whilst
Hmm.
Europeans venturing outside the diminishing British zone of control literally took their lives in their own hands, the evacuation itself was not hindered by either the NLF or Flossie, mainly because they were turning their weapons on each other. As November had progressed, it had become apparent that Flossie had never broken out of their Aden-centric trade union stronghold. The NLF controlled the interior, as well as the Federation Army and police. It was becoming very apparent who would govern the country once the British finally pulled out.
Oh, damn.
And that end game was approaching fast. In the early afternoon on the 26th of November, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders finally left Crater. During the previous 144 days, they had encountered 122 armed
Fuck.
incidents.
It's like
They'd
once a
lost 2
day.
men killed, to be added to the 3 dead on the 20th of June, and 26 men wounded. In return, they'd killed 25 insurgents. Driving straight to the RAF base, they boarded their flights home, and just over 24 hours later, they were landing at RAF Lynham in Wiltshire. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Mitchell, Mad Mitch, was still a hero to many. However, there were a growing number of politicians and others questioning his tactics in Aden, not least fellow Scot and campaigning Labour MP Tamdl.
I'd like to hear some like
And his
interviews and
very use of
whatnot.
the press and the way that he
covering all
seemed to
that.
relish his maverick approach had not endeared him to the military hierarchy either. Many of them pointed out that whilst the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders found fame taking over Crater, there were many other military units putting their lives on the line in Aden at that time too, including the Lancashire Regiment, the South Wales Borderers, the Prince of Wales' own Yorkshire Regiment, the Parachute Regiment, and 45 Commando Royal Marines. It irked them that Mad Mitch got all the plaudits. He was told he wouldn't be promoted to colonel on his return, nor
Damn.
would he be awarded the DSO, which he would have expected as a battalion commander. Within a year,
What's the
he
DSO?
resigned his commission. He'd later
No
embarked on a
kidding.
short career
He
as a
was
member
not
of
fucking
Parliament
around.
before co-founding the Halo Trust, a charity that works to remove mines from previous conflict zones.
Damn, okay, that's cool.
Colin Mitchell died in 1996, aged 71. Following the
Damn.
departure of Mitchell and his
What
battalion
a
on the
career,
26th of
dude.
November, the evacuation of the last forces in Aden sped up. 2 days later, one para were evacuated. That left just 45 Commando Royal Marines and some Royal Engineers. At 3 p.m. on the 29th of November 1967, the Royal Marines boarded Wasp helicopters sent in from HMS Albion. Last aboard was their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Di Morgan.
No
It
kidding.
was somewhat fitting that it was the Royal Marines who had landed to capture Aden in 1839, and it was the Royal Marines who were the last British forces out of the colony 128 years later.
Damn. Now it's
Half an
kind of
hour
drawing
later,
some
with the
similarities
Royal
with
Marines safely aboard,
Afghanistan.
HMS Albion weighed anchor and with a long blow on her horn left the waters of Aden. Unlike almost every other former colony when the British left, there'd been no official handover to the incoming government. The NLF took over and established the Marxist state of South Yemen, allied to the Soviet Union. Eventually their regime fell and the country united with their northern neighbour to form one country of Yemen. Yemen now finds itself in a bitter civil war and humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
In many respects, I can't help thinking that the recent evacuation of NATO forces from Kabul has a lot of parallels with the Aden
interesting.
emergency. How
Yeah.
about you?
Yeah, no.
Britain locked in a war in a country
Was
they
it
didn't
also
want
like
to be in, and
Saigon?
which they couldn't get out fast enough. But would staying have been any better? I'll let you decide. But at the end of the day, what strategic or economic purpose did the port, let alone the wider country, offer Britain in a world where her influence and her ability to play policeman was declining? And how many more British servicemen's lives would such a policy have cost? As it was, the Aden emergency of 1964 to 67 cost the lives of 90 servicemen dead and 510 men wounded. It's a little remembered colonial
Indeed.
war. And yet, with so many British regiments involved, as well as RAF personnel, and not forgetting those crews
Yeah, that's
in the
true.
Royal
There's a
Naval
lot of
Task
units
Force,
involved with this.
there are probably a lot of friends and relatives of ours who were there at some time during the period. So, if nothing else, it's a story worth telling, just for them.
Yeah, no kidding.
Thanks for
Especially,
joining me today,
again,
and I
like-
hope you enjoyed that story about the Aden emergency.
I did. This was like incredibly well done. This is the History Chap YouTube channel. Of course, I'll put the original video down in the description. Definitely go and give them a like and subscribe. That was really well done, really well put together. I mean, again, it's such like a kind of nuanced topic, at least for me now, like as an American here in 2025, not something that I would have been exposed to otherwise. So again, kind of like he was saying, if you guys have any relatives, or again, if you even if you served yourself during that time, specifically during this conflict, let me know what it was like to kind of be put in that, or you know what you've heard from that kind of situation, because it sounds like a very tough spot to be in. Like, I mean, when you have a timeline of like, we will be leaving at this time, it's like, where's the motivation? But also at the same time, you just have all this infighting, all these people trying to set themselves up to lead the government once the Brits leave. It's kind of just like you're almost like he was saying, like a spectator to all of this. And this is why I love having a YouTube channel like this, because I would just not have, again, and I've said it a couple times in this video already, I would never have been exposed to something like this if it weren't for the channel and if it weren't for y'all specifically. So I mean, it's just weird that's kind of like out in the ether, kind of. I mean, I guess it's not weird in my line of work to be talking with like our partners and allies, but it is cool to kind of meet people who are familiar with the channel and who are actually like offering these topics, who have kind of put in the thoughts after watching a video of, it'd be really interesting to kind of get his feedback, or to have him be exposed to this specific topic. And it's awesome because now I can take that and I can share it with all of y'all. So it's really cool. And again, it's really is a privilege to have this platform to be able to do that with all of y'all. And it blows my mind that we're almost at like 600,000 subscribers, 600,000 people who could potentially get recommended this video and kind of have this story be kind of sent out to all of y'all and get that exposure out to all of y'all. So yeah, it's really, really cool and really kind of humbling for me to be able to have that position. But definitely let me know your guys' thoughts down in the comment section, especially if you weren't familiar with this specific conflict or the battle or the Aden emergency before. I'd like to hear your feedback. And again, kind of if it's drawing any similarities that I'm not picking up on, I'd like to hear y'all's feedback for that as well. But that is it for this video. I'll see y'all in the next one.